Okay, so what we're talking about is, like I said, Buddha's way of seeing the universe, seeing the world, seeing what is happiness, what is suffering, what is a sentient being, what is a mind, what are the causes of happiness, what are the causes of suffering. And like I said, there's the essential way, well, there's various ways of saying what Buddha is saying. But like I said before, the final point, the essence, the main point, the whole point is that Buddha says that right now, our minds, if we're in samsara, quote unquote, it means that our minds are completely caught up with these various, literally, simply speaking, various misconceptions about the very nature of our own self, about what happiness is, about what suffering is. And because of this, we're completely not in touch with reality. So we see one thing, but in reality it's something else. We expect one thing, but in fact we get something else. So we're always this terrible disconnect between how things are and how we see things. And this is an exactly correct way to say how Buddha's entire approach. So he says the world is a certain way. The world is a certain way. For example, our consciousness, he says, our mind. He says it is not physical. So he's arguing with the view that it's the brain. He's arguing with the view that we're only physical. He's suggesting there's something subtler. But he's also arguing with the other views that assert a thing called a soul or a spirit, some essential fundamental characteristic in there that usually in those viewpoints is the product of a creator. Buddha completely disagrees. That is not his view at all. He would say that the main cause of where we come from is our own past, our own continuity of mental moments. This moment of who I am comes from the previous moment of who I am, and that previous moment comes from this previous moment, and that comes from the previous moment, and you track it right back, and you get back to the first second of conception, and then you track your consciousness back to a previous moment, and so on and so forth. This unbroken chain of mental moments going back and back and back. That's the fundamental point here. That's the basis of all of Buddha's teachings about karma. That's the basis of all of Buddha's teachings about how the mind works. So we have to take that as our hypothesis here. Otherwise, it's what Buddha's saying doesn't connect. So we have to take this as the fundamental view. This is the fundamental point that we take as our hypothesis in order to understand how that mind works and what it is that brings us happy experiences and suffering experiences. So like I said, there's one way of presenting all of this. Excuse me, I have a cup of tea. One way of presenting all of this, indeed, is in samsara, in terms of samsara and nirvana. So what we're trying to do is get out of samsara and accomplish our own nirvana, cessation of suffering and its causes. So this mind of ours, this packaging of the teachings that the Tibetans called our lineage, Tsongkhapa, 14th century lineage Lama, he's like our patron saint, if you like. This label for the packaging of all Buddha's teachings is the Lam Rim, gradual path, or path gradual. Well, a course. It's a course. And the end result, you graduate as a Buddha. So you've got the first stages of practice and the second stages, or as Lama Zopa would politely call it, which is the translation of the terms in Tibetan, the teachings and practices suitable to the disciple of the least capability, and the teachings and practices suitable to the disciple of the middle capability. Well, that's the wisdom wing. This nice analogy I use constantly, which is really helpful. The wisdom wing. This is the nuts and so this is where we learn about karma, this natural law of karma that runs the universe, the natural law within which the lives and minds of all beings run. It's a way of describing what happens, is Buddha's observation. It's law of cause and effect. We learn about that in the first level of practice, junior school. And the essence of the first level of practice, the essence of it, the summary of it, is to abide by the laws of karma, which means practice virtue, don't practice non-virtue. Why? Because this is the Buddha's view, as we've been discussing. That everything we think and do and say, driven by a delusion, is labeled a negative action. It sows a seed in the mind just naturally, and eventually nothing goes astray. It will manifest as one suffering. In general, an action that we do, karma, action, driven by a positive state of mind, is a virtuous action. It will sow a seed in the mind that won't disappear, won't go astray, and eventually ripens as one's happiness in the future. And given logically, we want happiness and don't want suffering, then this becomes the first stage of our practice. First level, urgent level of practice, as Lama Zopa says. First, immediate, start now. At least refrain from harming sentient beings, which is the heaviest level of negative actions. It's not the only ones. This is the fundamentals of Buddhist, sort of the nuts and bolts of all of Buddha's philosophical view of the universe. This is expressed in this understanding of karma. This we learn it first in junior school. This is the first level of practice. Then this subdues our body and speech to some degree. We stop harming sentient beings, and we internally become a more rational, more reasonable, more content, more wise, more disciplined person. We are the beneficiaries of this. There's no question. But then it qualifies us to get to the next stage of practice, middle scope, junior high school, where now we get to the essence of being a Buddhist. We learn to become intimately familiar with the workings of our own mind and start to fundamentally change it. This is the point. This is the point. So if we finish there, we graduated high school, then we would become an enemy destroyer. We would have destroyed the enemy, which is the delusions, the neuroses in the mind. We would become an arhat, an enemy destroyer. We would have achieved our own cessation of suffering and its causes. But the Buddha, the Mahayana view says we can go further. We can go to the compassion wing. We can go to university. And we're not discussing that here. That's not the topic here. But this will be the underlying motivation for us if we are on that path. We don't want to graduate at high school. We want to graduate. We want to get to university, and then we want to get to postgraduate, which is the Vajrayana. So we're on that path. So our motivation is to go further. But we're discussing here this weekend, the first and second scopes. So in essence, we did that essentially the last 2 days. We've discussed karma, a little bit how it works. We can go into more detail. We can go into detail about how we purify it, and the mind. We've discussed that. So we'll just continue to discuss these things, because this is the nuts and bolts of all one's daily practice. This is the nuts and bolts of Buddha's philosophy and psychology. And as I said, also this is another way of presenting all of this stages of practice is in terms of the different levels of vows. Vows are this mental decision to refrain from certain actions. And the Buddha loves vows. Like we discussed, vows have this immense psychological power. And I think it's psychologically logical. When you make a firm decision to do or not do something, it's then that you do it. But if it doesn't even arise in your mind, then there's no impression left in your mind. The mind is the central thing in Buddhism. If we can't even intellectually understand what he means by the mind, then we really don't understand Buddhism at all. It's just a load of strange, mystical stuff, We have to understand at least the bare bones principles. You've got to start intellectually. Some of you here might not even like any of the Buddha's views, or you haven't really even begun to think about them, or you certainly have no confidence in any of them. That's perfectly fine. But you have to start intellectually comprehending, at least theoretically, what is the mind for the Buddha. Let's reiterate this point. Your consciousness, your mind, these words are synonymous. I think today we'll go more into the mind, the contents of the mind that's taught in this particular text, that's taught in the monastic university system, low rig, mind and awareness, which is coming absolutely from the Indians before the Buddha. He didn't just start fresh and make up his own stuff. So like I said yesterday, so we've got the mind. And it's the mind that creates karma. The law of karma is a way of presenting what plays out in the mind in our lives and experiences. So the Buddhist psychological model describes the contents of the mind, and the view of karma describes, on the basis of what the mind does, the consequences, what happens, how it works, what happiness is, and it's expressed in terms of happiness and suffering. Because as I said, if we look into our lives, This is a fundamental driving point for every living being, every ant, every monkey, every human. You observe people and creatures, you will see we're driven to find to have happy feelings, and we're driven to be free of unhappy feelings. And so, of course, the Buddha's fundamental point, essential point, fundamental point, central point is that happiness, which is a state of mind, and suffering, which is a state of mind, that happiness is gained by change, therefore is gained by changing the mind, and that suffering is stopped by changing the mind. This is not very natural for us. Why? Because we are so addicted, aren't we, to external circumstances and things, the objects of our mind. The moment we open our eyes, we are completely involved in what we call the world. And the world is out there. We're this little kind of thing in the middle, plonked in the middle of this world. And as far as we're concerned, the world, the people, the things, the sounds, the smells, the tastes, the objects of the world, they are the source of our happiness, and they are the source of our suffering. So we spend our lives, and so do the ants and the monkeys, pursuing certain phenomena, believing that when we get them, we'll get happy, and then avoiding the rest. That's how we spend our lives. So that tells us what our philosophy is. We mightn't even articulate it, but that tells us that we totally believe that happiness is in the things and the people, and that suffering is in the things and the events and the people. It's really evident, you know. Buddha's not disagreeing that these don't play a role. It's clear they play a role, but he says we're missing the main point. We're missing the essential point. Which is what goes on in the mind. That's his expertise. It's very simple. It's not a complicated concept. It's just that we're so unfamiliar with it. I mean, Lama Zopa says, and this is very shocking to hear, but analyze it. The vast majority of all beings on this planet, all humans, forget the rest, have absolutely no idea that what goes on in their mind plays any role at all in their lives. Now think about how shocking that sounds. Think about it. The vast majority of all humans on this planet have absolutely no idea that what goes on in their mind plays any role at all in their lives. Now that is profound mental illness, you have to admit, but that's what Buddha means by being samsaric. And don't hear it's religious. It's psychology. It's common sense, you know. It's so clear we think this. It's so clear we live our lives like this. We know there are things going on in our mind. We know there's anger and happiness and love and intelligence. We know that. But we think the main things that determine our happiness and suffering are the objects of our mind, the people, the events, the external things. It's very clear. We spend all our lives totally immersed in the external. Again, don't hear this as religious, you know. It's practical. So Buddha's expertise is the mind, how it functions, and his skill to help us become familiar with what on earth is going on in our mind. Why? Because for him, that is the source, the main source of happiness and suffering. So it's a really sophisticated job to do. It's not some mysterious, mystical job, which is how we think about it when we hear it initially. It's a really, you know, I always say this, but the level of clarity and precision and the depth of analysis that we know we need even to make a cake. Forget about becoming a genius musician or a genius physicist. The level of clarity and precision and depth of analysis that we know is necessary to even make a cake. This is exactly the level of clarity and precision and depth of analysis we need to cultivate in order to become familiar with the workings of our own mind. I mean, it's really fascinating. These Indians before the Buddha, they're the ones who began, as His Holiness says, they're the ones who began the investigation into the nature of self. This is more than 3,000 years ago. So we talk that way, and we talk about understanding the mind. But what we say, what we mean by this, I'm not criticizing, but it's just different. We mean the brain. We mean the brain, becoming familiar with the brain. We're brilliant geniuses at understanding the physical. Nothing wrong with this. It's an incredible thing. And there's so much meeting now between these two completely opposite views. The Buddhist view, the Buddhist view that is expert at knowing this is the point. It's hard for us to hear this, but the Buddha's expertise is the workings of the actual subjective cognitive process itself, not the brain, not the physical. You ask those guys back then where their brain was, they would not know. But this is the point that's quite unique for the Buddhist one. Initially, we can't hear it. We need to develop this incredible, brilliant precision, clarity in the job of being able to see and then become intimately familiar with all the thousands upon thousands upon thousands of thoughts at a much subtler level than we can even imagine at the moment. That's Buddha's expertise, and that's why we need shamatha. It's this incredible ingenious technique invented by these Indians more than 3,000 years ago. It's still living. It's still an extant, living technique right now. People like you and me right now cultivating single-pointed concentration. This is incredibly brilliant, incredible psychological skill, the likes of which do not exist in our modern scientific culture. It's a fact. It's very simple. And what that technique does is hone our capacity for cognition to a subtle, refined degree of such brilliance that we have no equivalent. So the best we can do is talk about it or read the texts. So for example, Lama Yeshe, how he talks about some of the qualities we would have if we had accomplished this single-pointed concentration. So that's the technique. That's the microscope. You need a microscope. Once you've accomplished them, once you've got the microscope, you don't just look at the microscope and think how wonderful. You use the microscope. You use the microscope to then use it to go in deeply into the mind itself. And this is so confusing for us. I mean, when we think of our mind, we know if we close our eyes, there's just this chaos there. We know that. And we take that as a given, as something normal, don't we? The mind's just chaotic. We're born like it, and it's just the way it is. We don't really have that many techniques in our culture, do we? We don't have that many techniques in our culture. We don't have many techniques in our modern culture that enable us to become intimately familiar with the workings of the mind, because we're emphasizing the brain. Nothing wrong. But we of course then take it as a given. We think it's completely natural when we close our eyes just to hear this constant train of thoughts. We know that unedited, uncontrolled, unceasing, and not volitional. It just feels this pouring forth, isn't it? So we know that's natural. We don't quite know why it's like that. We don't have explanations. I mean, that's the point. So, in order to understand the Buddha's take on this is where we have to, at least theoretically, take on board the idea of continuity of consciousness. In the same way that if you look in, like I say, if you've got a lot of skill if you've developed a certain skill, you're familiar with piano playing, you're familiar with mathematics, you know very well what's involved. The fact that you today can play brilliant piano, logically the main cause of it is your familiarity with it, your habituation with music, your practice. Well, in exactly the same way, taking this as a theory, if we can see a tiny child, we can see ourselves as little people. We know that our anger was there, our jealousy was there, and they seem very spontaneous, didn't they? This is one very simple way of describing what Buddha means by karma, that we come into this life, if we take this view of the mind being a continuity, coming from its own past, not mummy and daddy. That's a very weird idea in Buddha. The more you think about Buddha's teachings, the more weird it is to think that your anger, your love, your psychosis, your being good at music can be given to you by mummy and daddy. That's a very weird concept in Buddhism. The more you take on board the theories of the Buddhist view about the mind, this is just not a possibility. It's just too strange, you know. The Buddha's unique point is that our own mind is completely and totally personal. Whatever is in it is only from what we've put in it before. So we take this theory and we see little children. I mean, I'm just watching recently on YouTube, you know, some of these 3-year-olds and 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds conducting orchestras, writing, you know, orchestral, writing symphonies for 60-piece orchestras, you know, playing incredible music. I mean, it's completely impossible to comprehend this if we take our ordinary view. It's impossible. You can't. Well, the Buddhist explanation is not complicated, you know. It's a bunch of habits. So any habit we have, this is now bringing in karma and the mind together. Any habit we have, whether it's loving or kind or compassionate or angry or jealous or being good at music or being good at killing, it's a bunch of habits. This is one of the key ways Buddha's saying the mind works. Because nothing goes astray. Everything we ever think is programmed in the mind. One way, as Geshe Tashi, one Lama who was in London, as he said, it's like we're shooting a movie all day. Everything any sentient being experiences is stored as a memory in the mind. This is just the way the mind works. It's just the way it is, you know. So we come into this life fully programmed, Buddha says, with just some of the billions of karmic imprints, of seeds, of impressions, of programming from habits from before, you know. And this is the fundamental point in Buddhism. At least as a theory, to explain why little girls can play Bach at the age of 3, why some little girls can kill at the age of 3. We don't like to hear that because we all want to think the little girls are innocent. But if we take the view of continuity of consciousness, this is completely fitting, you know, at least as a theory. So the mind is everything for the Buddha. The mind, in fact, the biggest picture, the long-term view of the entire universe, everything is a product of the mind. Everything is a product of the mind. This is, I mean, it's kind of a shocking concept for us because in scientific views, the emphasis is on the physical matter. That's the expertise of our modern world, which is marvelous. So to hear that the cognitive process itself is the main cause of all happiness, the main cause of all realms of existence, the main cause of how the environment impacts upon us, the main cause of how people see us and hate us or love us or teach us or give us gifts or kill us. The main cause of what goes on in minds. So to understand the concept of karma and to understand this view of the mind, we need to take on this hypothesis that it's not physical, that it's a beginningless and endless continuity of mental moments. It doesn't work otherwise. There's no concept, there's no possibility otherwise. It won't work otherwise. As a theory, as a hypothesis, we must do this. So of course, if you don't particularly want to, you don't need to. Maybe you just want to take some aspects of Buddhism, and you can do that. But you're right, you know, no one's the boss. You're the boss. But we're talking the big picture point of view here. So, okay, like I said yesterday, we can talk about the way the mind functions. We learn this when we study the texts. My tea there, Kate. More tea. We can look at this text and we can see, and this is already very powerful, I mentioned it briefly yesterday, that we have 2 ways that our mind functions, 2 ways that our mind cognizes. We have sensory consciousness, that is to say, that part of our mind, remember mind is not physical, that functions through the medium of the eyeball and the skin and the nerves and the nose and the ear. We have them, we're clear, the 5, isn't it? We know these. So mind, whenever you say the word mind or consciousness, these words broadly are synonymous in Buddhism. And it's referring to this non-physical cognitive energy, non-physical capacity for cognition. That's consciousness. I remember Dalai Lama one time in commentary on Mahamudra, he said that we can easily learn all these things about the mind. We can learn these words, and we must, it's central. But he said to really directly experience your mind, he says, this is really quite sophisticated. Because think about it, if it's not physical, you can't taste it, touch it, smell it, hear it, see it. Or we can just see the evidence of it. Then it's quite hard to actually directly experience one's mind. This is highly sophisticated. So we have sensory consciousness. Sensory consciousness Excuse me, I'm just organizing my tea. Sensory let me turn off my email. Hang on a minute. There's bips and bops. Okay. So we have that part of our mind, this cognitive process that functions through the medium of the body, basically, isn't it? So, of course, you know, we are so preoccupied with our body. As far as, you know, Lama Yeshe says, we make the body the boss. And it's pretty reasonable. I mean, our mind exists in this body. Our mind and the body live together. They're combined, inextricably linked at different levels. Like if we take the Vajrayana model, we've got gross consciousness, which is the level of our consciousness, which includes the sensory, that's inextricably linked to this physical body. Then we have subtle consciousness, which is this is Vajrayana. Subtle consciousness, which the only time we touch that is when we dream. That's inextricably linked to its own set of physical energy, very detailed descriptions in the Vajrayana about the subtle physical energies. And then we've even got very subtle consciousness, very subtle mind, you know. So here, as we look at the gross level, we've got the sensory consciousness, that part of our mind that is not physical, that functions through the medium of the body. And we can see if we look at the external world, it's by definition the objects of the five senses, isn't it? All the people, all the events, all the food, all the things, they're the objects of our five senses. And because it looms so large for us, the second we open our eyes from sleep, that's what we're confronting, is the external world, the objects of our senses. So of course we make the body the boss. And indeed that's reiterated, isn't it, in our materialist philosophical views, that that's all there is. There's only that. We don't posit in our modern militarist philosophical views. There is no other thing posited. We can see that. It's very clear. So we have the sensory consciousnesses. We give them enormous power. Think about it. I think we determine our happiness and suffering in terms of the senses. If your body feels fairly nice one day, there's no particular pain, maybe you feel slightly lighter, then you think you're called happiness. It's called happy. You just had a meal. You're enjoying the food. That's completely sensory. That's completely, for us, what we call happiness. Or indeed, when you eat too much, it's what's called suffering. So our body, we can see, is incredibly sensitive. And we're spending most of the day adjusting, aren't we? Adjusting our relationship with the external objects in order to make sure we try to keep some pleasant sensory experiences. If there's a smell that's too ugly, we will try to get rid of it, isn't there? If the smell is very pleasant, we'll go towards it. If the taste is delicious, we'll go towards it. If it gets too horrible, we'll go away from it. If there's, everything is like this. We're overwhelmed by the senses. It's so obvious. We're overwhelmed. We're completely preoccupied by the five sense objects. And this is the world as far as we're concerned. So we give far more power. This is the point now. We give so much, infinitely more power to these objects or to our senses than they actually have. So as I said, and one simple way of pointing this out is if you take that example I used yesterday when I look at a cup and I say, that's a pretty cup. I mean, we talk this all the time. It's so simple. We never question. What we're saying is that my eyeball is seeing a pretty cup. If I'm in love with Fred, if I'm in love with Martin, I believe that my eyes are seeing a divinely handsome person. We know, look at these sensory experiences we have in relation to a person who, it's our five senses are responding, isn't it? So of course we think then we believe our eyes, our eyes are seeing a handsome person. And then we all know, let's say when he gives me up and leaves me, now my eyes look at the same. This ought to blow our minds. This ought to help us realize emptiness. This ought to blow our minds, but it doesn't because we take things for granted. We know perfectly true. One day I'm in love with Martin and then I discover he's cheating on me. Now, the same eyes, the same object. He has only got a day older, no extra gray hair, no extra fat. Now what do my eyes see? I can't even look at him. I can't even hear his name. I'm so full of revulsion, so full of anger. So we have to analyze. This is clearly not just, it's absurd to think that's a sensory experience. It's completely nonsense. It's evident it's not the senses. It's clear it's the mental consciousness. That's the point. That's the distinction. We have sensory consciousness and we have mental consciousness. So mental consciousness is where the workshop is, as Lama Zopa says. And like I'm saying, that's Buddha's expertise. The workings of this mental consciousness. So as we know, as we discussed briefly, Buddha's view, Buddhist psychology, divides the contents of our mental consciousness, this is the gross level, the level we function day to day, into 3 categories. There's no fourth. It's kind of almost initially a shock. It's too simplistic. We think of psychiatry, and there must be volumes and volumes and volumes of highly intricate, labeled sick mental illnesses, for example. Every day we're discovering new ones. So complex. And if we think about dividing all the contents of our mental experiences into 3 categories, it's just not how we talk. It's complete. And when we hear the Buddhas, it almost seems it's too cute. Negative, positive, and the third lot, which they call neutral, which doesn't mean not important. We'll discuss it in a minute. 3 categories. There's no fourth category. Whatever goes on in our mind, all this chaos of these unedited, uncontrolled millions of thoughts and feelings and emotions. It's almost too shocking to hear. It could be so simple. Divided into 3 categories. There's no fourth. So the 3 are those that are neurotic. Crucially, those that are I-based. I-based. All based on all the unhappy ones, all the deluded ones, all the distressing ones, all the disturbing ones, all the neurotic ones. All these are words we can easily use as synonyms for this first category. Have 2 main characteristics. One is they're deeply disturbing. And this is evident. This is immediately evident to any one of us. Just observe how you're feeling, and you're feeling agitated. You have to check, it's depression, or it's anger, it's this, or it's that. You don't, when you say, oh, you feel so loving, you don't say, are you feeling disturbed? No, it's a pleasant feeling. But the unhappy ones, the neurotic ones, the first category, they're the ones that Buddha says we can get rid of. They're the ones Buddha says, they say it in Buddhist psychology, these are adventitious. Means they're not integral to who we are. They're not at the core of our being. This is itself, that's a shock, because as we understand in our modern psychology, we take them as an absolute given, as normal, ordinary states of mind of a normal, ordinary person. So normal that we think you'd be abnormal if you didn't have some attachment, some anger, some jealousy, some depression. That's how much we take them as for granted. This is not Buddha's view. So this first lot, the key characteristic of them is that they're experientially is that they're rooted in fear. They're not happy. They're fearful. Fear is their main flavor. This is surprising to us. People often, when we study the mind, you look at all the list of different states of mind that they describe in Buddhist psychology, and you'll notice there's no one state of mind labeled fear. So where does fear fit? We all know fear. Fear is a vivid experience. Panic, anxiety, fear. Well, it's because all these neurotic states of mind, and remember I said Buddha has identified 84,000, but luckily for our sakes, they all subsume into 3. We're going to go into these again. If we study low rig, we'll talk about 51 of them. Well, just some of those are the negative ones. Others are positive and others are neutral. So these unhappy states of mind, excuse me, the fear is their flavor. I mean, I think it's evident if we look at this, but we don't think this way. If you see a person angry, really shouting, crying, screaming, when you hear their words, you'll recognize they're angry. But if you didn't hear their words and you saw another person who was having a panic attack, what we call a panic attack, but you don't hear either of their words, the behavior would look the same. Eyes wide, shocked. So all delusions, all neuroses, all negative states of mind, all non-virtuous states of mind have this characteristic of being deeply disturbing. And that energy is fear, panic. And why? Well, this seems very abstract to us because they're all the voices, they're all the result, the manifestation of the root problem, the root affliction, as they say in the text, that's the term they use, the root mental illness, the root delusion, the root disturbing emotion, and that's called, and we're going to discuss this today, that's called simply ignorance. This is the root problem, such that when that is uprooted, and then we've perfected that realization, that's what nirvana means. So this root, if we look at the three, that all the 84,000 subsumed to these three, it's known as ego grasping. Colloquially, it's very tasty. Because all these unhappy states of mind, having fear, have an aspect of holding on, grasping, holding, grasping, you know. So ego grasping, the colloquial term for this main delusion, which is in English is ignorance. In Tibetan, ma-rigpa, unawareness. It's the Buddha's identified this as the deepest, subtlest, most primordial, most pervasive, the hardest to see, the hardest to recognize neurotic state of mind that underpins all the others. So we can learn these theories, but the only way to experience all this is to become intimately familiar internally on the basis. First, we start with what we can do, but as we progress in our practice, if and when we do develop some semblance of concentration, practicing shamatha, 99% of us won't give us, 99% of us won't go to the mountains, give up sex, drugs, and rock and roll and actually accomplish it, because that's the conditions you need to accomplish it. It is simply not possible, as ordinary people like we are, to accomplish it, you know, in our lunch break. It's like, you know, you're just not possible. You've got to have really extreme radical conditions that are perfectly conducive to really getting single-pointed concentration. And that, you know, is extraordinary already just to be that kind of person, to go to the mountain so you can get it. But we can practice it, there's no question, and we can get some semblance of focus. But to really do the job properly, as Lama Yeshe says in his Mahamudra, it is impossible to really unpack and unravel all this stuff and to get insight into emptiness, insight into reality without shamatha. It is impossible. Not because it's, again, a religious idea, because this stuff is so primordial, so complex, so deeply driven, so deeply instinctively in the bones of our being, that to do the job of unpacking and unraveling it and clarifying it all, it's not possible at a gross level. It's just not possible. We need to access the microscope of our mind, you know, which is what we get with calm abiding, shamatha. So, okay, so these neurotic states of mind, and that's just a useful word, you know, we use that type very loosely, don't we? You know, the unhappy states of mind, disturbing states of mind, distressing. They have this key function of being, of causing us, this is the point now, of causing us to not be in touch with reality. And that's not a grand thing. It's very simple. It's very evident in our own experience every day, but we don't join the dots. We don't get to see it, you know. My example of Martin is such a clear one. When I have so these three that subsume, the three that the 84,000 subsume to, ego grasping, the root one, then that gives rise to attachment, which then gives rise to aversion. There's this intimate hierarchical relationship between these three. And all the other delusions are rooted in these three. It's a very sophisticated kind of map, you know, of the mind, mapped internally, not with a microscope out there. So we can see that when I've got huge attachment, let's say, for Martin, its key function is, and this is the key function of all of them, which is why they're called delusions, they exaggerate The delusions, all the unhappy emotions, have a function of exaggerating certain aspects of the object. And we know this so clearly in daily life, but we never get the point. We don't get the learning from it. We live in our daily lives between attachment and aversion. This is normal. This is really what samsara is. We live like this. All beings do. Monkeys and ants and humans. We all live in attachment and aversion. Why? Because attachment's job is to find the things, the events, the objects, the sounds, the smells, the tastes, such that when we have contact with them, a happy feeling is triggered. That's the mechanics of it. So attachment is this maniac inside us, this junkie, this frantic junkie in the bones of our being that's desperately searching every second for an object, a thing, an event, a sound, a smell, a taste. And this is the gross level, such that when we have contact with it, pleasant feelings are triggered in my mental consciousness and my sensory consciousness. That's what we call getting happy. And then when the attachment doesn't get the right object, or we get the object and then it changes inevitably because it can't last, we'll go into this, then aversion, the third one, aversion is then triggered. Aversion, this panic attack of getting what attachment doesn't want. And that's anger, annoyed, irritated, frustrated, all the way to depression. And this is working all the time, naturally. And our trouble is, our tragedy is, our total tragedy is, because we're not focusing on what is happening in the mind. We only notice what's happening in the mind, this attachment and this aversion, when they're violently strong, when the body is fiercely involved. And then we notice that something's going on in the mind. But it's like, it's way too late. It's like going 100 miles an hour on the freeway and you notice your wheels are falling off. It's like Vesuvius is now exploding and you're wondering what should I do about it? It's a bit late. This is the main reason we have so much mental torture in our culture, because we don't notice what's happening in the mind until it expresses itself physically and verbally. And you kill yourself or your husband. This is literally a very technical point. So Buddha's great, unbelievable skill is to give us the skills that enable us to pay attention to the mind before it becomes emotional, before it hits the body. This is the point, So we can see every day our experiences tell us that the attachment and aversion are misconceptions. That's their key function. They're liars. They have this massive emotional component, yes, and we're preoccupied with that because it's so physical, and that throws us. And it's shocking to hear that if you see a person who's raging angry, which is evidently physical, if you see a person having a panic attack, which is physical, if you see a person raging, crying with jealousy, it's shocking to hear that what's actually happening is that their mind, that jealousy, that anger, they are, if you start to analyze them, they're deeply, extremely exaggerated, distorted, absurd, conceptual stories describing the person, describing the event. And they're exaggerated, they're distorted, they're delusional. They exaggerate. That's the key function of all the delusions. They exaggerate what's there. So, but like I said before, it's so clear. When I'm in love with Martin, when attachment is prevalent, my eyes see the most divine person I've ever seen in my life. We know that. And it's so clear. Excuse me. It's so clear that there's no objective truth in it, but we don't join the dots. It's so fascinating. I mean, if his ex-wife is also looking at him right today, along with me, we know very well her description of Martin will not be the same as my description. We're seeing the same object, the same person at this same moment. And what she sees is a horrible, ugly, mean, nasty, awful person who is the cause of her suffering. And I will see a divine, blissful, delicious, heavenly person who is the cause of my happiness. This is not even Buddhism. This is evident. This is how we talk. But we don't join the dots. We just laugh at it. We just laugh. We don't get the point. This should help us realize emptiness immediately, that nothing has an intrinsic nature, that it's how our mind sees it. It's so evident. It's staring us in our face. That each of us has a story about that object. And each of our stories, being attachment and aversion, is completely distorted. There's some reality. I mean, the fact that he cheated on her with me, that's truth. The fact that he's kind to me, that's truth. But those events distort our view. So it's very evident that the first category of these three states of mind are delusional. It's very clear, we get it, but we don't think of it like this. We take them for granted. So the key function of this first category of states of mind in the mental consciousness that are the source of all problems, but which Buddha has found are adventitious, which means we can get rid of them. How amazing, how incredible. They're disturbing, deeply disturbing. Just the very having of them, you're freaking out. And they're liars. So this is the part that's hard to see, because we're so addicted to our physical experiences. We're so addicted to, when we think of anger, we think of the body shaking. When we think of depression, we think of ourselves inert in bed, unable to move. When we describe our feelings, the best we can do is describe feelings. The anger, the hurt, the ache, the pain. That's physical. That's physical. So what's the mental part? Well, this is where we have to get to go deeper into the mind to start to hear. At the moment, heard from just like a good analogy. If you hear, like a football crowd, 50,000 people all shouting, and you're 2 kilometers away. It's just a roar, isn't it? It's just a roar of sound. And because though, you know what it is because you're familiar with the fact that the football stadium is 2 kilometers away. But you just hear this roar. Now, theoretically it's 50,000 individual beings, each saying some words. But it's impossible to delineate them, isn't it? It's impossible. So what do you have to do? You've got to get closer. Can you imagine, to get the theory clear? So in the end, if you were really brilliant, it's like getting a microscope on any organism. You just see a face. When you get a microscope in, you're going to see millions of tiny cells. We understand the analogy here. It's perfect. Well, Buddha's skill with shamatha is that's the microscope. We must put on this roar inside our head so we can start to see and hear precisely. This is what we're really finally capable of. Every single tiny thought that makes up that roar. They're all thoughts. This is the biggest shock to us. They're all thoughts. But because we've had them for so long, they are virtually instinctive now, So instinct for the Buddha is it's a good concept. Everything, whatever we say is instinctive, from the Buddhist perspective, is something that you've practiced that often that now it's automatic. Well, we call that learning. We drive cars instinctively. We play the piano instinctively. We learn maths instinctively. We can see that. We're very good. It's just that we know it's the habit from having done it before to the point where now it's automatic. You see that person putting their hands on and that's the point about a 3-year-old playing the piano. Instead of just going mysteriously, my God, that's a mystery, no one knows why. It's fairly evident. If a 3-year-old can play the piano, and if we deduce that they've got a mind that isn't their brain, and if we deduce that everything in the mind is just a bunch of habits, we have to deduce logically that she's played the piano before. How else can you conclude? If you see a little, I remember reading, about one American serial killer years ago, an interview, and how he said since a tiny child, he used to torture people, and he said since a tiny child, he remembered being compelled to torture the creatures. He said he didn't know why. No one taught him. He was compelled to do it. It was a habit in his mind. This is one way of describing simply karma. It's everything. One way that karma ripens is one way that having done something before ripens is pretty evident, is the habit to keep doing it. So if you know, as since a little child, you observe your mind, you know. There's this little guy who was compelled to torture creatures. If we take the Buddhist view, he came into this life programmed with that particular habit. The little girl who plays Bach at the age of 3, she clearly came into this life with deeply embedded habits, familiarity with music, such that she just puts her hands on the piano and off she goes. I mean, it's not a difficult concept. We just have to posit the possibility that the brain isn't the only thing involved. If the brain is the only thing involved, then you have to agree it's absurd. There is no explanation. It's very clear, you know, either for the child who tortures the creatures or for the child who plays Bach, you know. So the Buddha's view is essentially every millisecond of what we think and do and say, none of it goes astray. Everything is in the mind as a memory, and everything is qualified by the characteristic of whether it's virtuous or non-virtuous, you know. So in the mind, we can see there are millions of thoughts, all there, feelings and thoughts. But if they're very quiet, most of the time they're quiet, aren't they? There's like this quiet roar underneath. But we know when they become stronger, if it's like a lot of anger and a lot of jealousy or a lot of fear, they come to the surface and the body is then involved. And that's only when we notice them. And that's when it's way too late. But that's because we don't pay attention. That's what shamatha gives us, is this brilliant ability, even just to begin to practice 5 minutes a day, focusing your mind, paying attention to one thing. What you're doing is you're training yourself to pay attention. So then you come out of your meditation and you'll develop that skill. You bring that skill to pay attention into your daily life, that's all. And you learn to pay attention to what's in your mind, especially while you're driving, while you're doing the dishes. You don't wait for it to come out of your mouth. That's too late. That's Vesuvius exploding. That's the wheels falling off. So these thoughts in there, these feelings in there, this river of thoughts, thousands. We can see there's no logic to any of them. There's no coherence. They seem to, you know, like, you know yourself when you're trying to get to sleep at night. You think you're going mad, don't you? You think you're going crazy. Uncontrolled berserk thoughts. They're thoughts, we can see it. And why, see, the thing is, that's what's happening all the time. But because in the day, we're so preoccupied by the external objects, you know, that you don't notice. But at night, you've got nothing else to notice. You've got no visual objects. You've got nothing else to listen to. Your body's just lying in the bed. So all these thoughts that are always there anyway are looming large, and you think you're going crazy. Well, that's how they are all the time. So we have Buddha's giving us skills to learn to cultivate focus, so that we can start to go ever deeper and to pay attention to all that, and start to get closer in and start listening to every one of those 50,000 voices and articulate every one. That's the brilliant skill. When you read the qualities of having accomplished single point of concentration, it sounds for the world like science fiction. The level of clarity, we can't even conceive of it. And it's, we don't have to wait till you get single point of concentration. There's so much work we can do even now, even without concentration. We can do something. We all do so much at the intellectual level. So the job is then, if what goes on in our mind is the main source of our happiness and suffering, then it is evident that our job is to become familiar with what's in the mind. That's very clear. And that's Buddha's expertise. So we divide, first of all, the contents of all these chaotic thoughts in there into 3 categories. Those that are based in the root neurosis, the root misconception, the root delusion, the ignorance, maripa, the one that causes us to truly believe in a separate, concrete, set in stone, solid, panic-stricken sense of me. Total delusion. On the basis of that, the root delusion, then on the basis of that, the main voice of that is arising in day-to-day life, and that's called attachment. This panic-stricken vampire, junkie inside us that is frantic to get what that supposed I wants. And then when it doesn't, that's anger, the third one. These three, if we could understand even theoretically these three, we have a profound basis for understanding our entire mind and therefore the minds of others. Because all the other delusions are branched into these three. It's a very precise presentation in the Buddhist model. So, it's like, okay, the first lot are deluded, exaggerated, distorted, emotional misconceptions. The next lot are valid, reasonable, virtuous, appropriate states of mind. They're called love, compassion, empathy, kindness, intelligence. We know these. Patience, forgiveness. Very clear, very immediate. We know these. These, at this relative level, are not distorted. They are not delusional. They are not exaggeration. They are not primordially I-based. They are to some degree until we realize emptiness. But on a conventional level, these are valid states of mind. And what's fascinating here is valid for the Buddha, a valid cognition is a moment of mind that is in sync with its object, because mind always cognizes something. So when there's a valid state of mind, there's a reasonable relationship. There's no big disconnect between the object and the subject. Subject is mind and the object. So when I have attachment for Martin, the attachment in me for Martin is completely is coming from a frantic sense of a separate me that causes me to be hungry, to manipulate, to exaggerate, to hold on to possess, and it all exaggerates his deliciousness and exaggerates his capacity to make me happy. That's the function of attachment. Now, if that were only what I had and didn't have love, I would be a vampire. I would eat Martin for breakfast if I were hungry and then spit out the bones. Attachment is quite monstrous. But luckily, for us, it's tempered by our virtuous states of mind. It's tempered by my love for Martin, which is delight in his happiness, which is a valid state of mind that sees Martin, to some relative degree to who he is, wants him to be happy, reaches out to him, is connected to him. These states of mind are connected to the other, and they're not separate from. They are marvelous. These are powerful states of mind. And these are the ones we have to grow, and the others we have to get rid of. The trouble is, these are like the weeds and the flowers. If your weeds very politely grew at one end of the garden and your flowers grew very nicely at the other, it will be easy to distinguish between them, wouldn't it? But right now, they don't. So if you don't know botany, it's a really simple example. I don't know botany, okay? I remember one time in Australia at our centre there, a teacher centre, a couple of miles north of Melbourne, and it's in the bush, as we call it in Australia, and it's very flat, and it looks to me just boring. There's always growing, there's 100 acres there, and there's always this stuff growing, but it's very sparse looking. It's not like rich forest or delicious gardens. It looks very sparse and boring. So I'm not a botanist, so I can't see a thing. Now, one of my nephews, Justin, is a horticulturist. So when we're walking on the path in this boring environment, and Justin is full of joy, he points to this little berry, this little leaf, that little thing, taste this one. He sees the most, his eyes, because he's got knowledge about what's there. He sees this rich, diverse, delicious things. I can see nothing because I don't have the labels for them. I just see a bunch of boring things. And that's right now how we are with our mind. We don't know how to articulate what's in here. We can't distinguish between the attachment and the love. We can't see the difference between the weed and the flower because we don't know Buddha's botany. And we're not talking, Jung, Freud, whatever you like, you can use whoever you like. But the Buddhist one is so, like I'm saying, it's so precise. It's so precise, it pins it down to not just the feeling that comes through the body, but the actual cognitive, conceptual story that each of these millions of thoughts is expressing. That's the level of clarity we have to develop so we can begin to then argue with the distorted view, the attachment, and lessen it and grow the love. It's a very technical job, I tell you. So right now, the attachment and the love literally come together, so much so that we think they're the same. We can't see the difference. That's a tragedy, you know, because they're so habitual. So we have to learn Buddhism. I mean, here we're talking Buddha's botany. First, we learn the theory. What is attachment? How does it function? What is love? How does it function? And then we can begin to observe the mind. But this is the hardest job we'll ever do because they're so spontaneously, automatically together, you know. Any questions? I understand. So Ingrid, I will answer this question. I will definitely do it, but I would just wonder if there's any questions from this conversation we've just had now, because it's fresh. I will definitely answer that. It's important. Are there any questions right now directly from this morning's discussion, afternoon's discussion? If there's not, it's fine. I'm not pushing.
There's one here from Stockholm.
Good. Okay, I understand. The point is, okay, let's just look at attachment and not look at the love, okay? Attachment, you see, this is the point. Because the delusions, because these neuroses are not accurate assessments of the object, okay? So because they're not accurate assessments of the object, they have this kind of life. Attachment over exaggerates. I can use the cake as, forget Martin, think of the cake. We've got to understand the attachment. First of all, it's an emotional hunger, a feeling of missing something. So naturally, if you're missing something, you try and imagine what you could get to fill up the pain, to make the pain go away, to get the object to fill up the hole. That's the energy first. So that drives me due to habit to go to the cake. So attachment is there's many other parts of my mind all helping attachment get what it wants, you know, but attachment's driving it. This feeling of kind of not having enough. Oh, you know, so haven't got, oh, what's missing? What's missing? Oh, cake. Then you grab onto the object in your mind, then you stand up and you go to get the cake. And all the time you're anticipating the cake, you're expecting the cake, you can't wait to get the cake. Why? Because you're expecting to get fulfillment. You're expecting the pleasure to come because you want to fill up the pain of not having. So you want to fill it up. So all this expectation, all the imagining, all the anticipating, and you get the cake and you put it in the mouth. So all this anticipating has made a completely extreme story about the deliciousness of the cake. And attachment believes the cake has all these qualities. And it looks so divine. It smells divine. The mind is so excited. So you put it into the mouth full of this expectation to get what? Happiness, pleasant feelings. And indeed, it does trigger pleasant feelings. There is no question. It definitely triggers pleasant feelings when the cake meets the mouth. There's no question. Pleasant feelings are triggered, and there's nothing wrong with pleasant feelings. This is the essence of Buddha's understanding of how samsara works. This is the essence of it. So there's incredible anticipation, incredible excitement, incredible exaggeration. The more hungry we are, the more divine Martin will look. The more fantasy, the more expectation. Cake or Martin, same. Keep it to the cake. So then you get the cake, and when you get contact with the cake, it does trigger. It definitely does trigger delicious feelings. There's no argument there. So these feelings are incredible. But look what happens. The millisecond you've even got the first mouthful, you're already grasping at the second mouthful. You can't, you can't even enjoy the first mouthful because the nature of attachment is frantic. So you grasp at the second mouthful, then you're enjoying the cake, but you're missing it really because already you're grasping at another mouthful to put it in. This is the nature of attachment. It's so hungry. So then you want another piece of cake because you're not satisfied with the piece you've had. The pleasure was very nice. And in reality, the pleasure will now go downhill. But attachment doesn't realize this. Attachment's not satisfied. So you get another piece of cake, expecting the same pleasure, but then the third piece of cake. And we know the trajectory now, the pleasure is diminishing. The pleasure is getting less. And what is arising now is a full stomach, and unpleasant feelings are now coming. And then eventually you stop eating the cake because you would vomit. So this is why the Buddha calls this the suffering of change. On the face of it, getting cake is the cause of happiness. On the face of it, as having Martin is the cause of happiness. For the Buddha, no, it's a subtler level of suffering. We have to do this deep analysis of the whole event. So in reality, all this attachment is a lie. It's over-exaggerating the deliciousness of Martin. So it expects him to make me happy. It expects him to do exactly what I want every second. It expects that. It's an inhumane thing. It's not possible he can fulfill all those expectations. The more hungry I am, the more manipulative I am, the more controlling I am, the more expecting I am of him to give me happiness. It's just not realistic. It's not possible. The cake can't do that, nor can Martin. So as long as in the beginning, Martin does all the lovely things that I want and looks at me and strokes me and calls me beautiful and smiles at me, my attachment will get what it wants. But this is the part that sounds brutal, so I'd rather use the cake instead of Martin, is we know the more attachment is convinced that because that moment of pleasure when you had the first mouthful, it was so delicious, the attachment assumes it'll be delicious for the second mouthful. And so then we'll believe it'll happen for the third mouthful. But reality is, if we watched it carefully, the pleasure from the first mouthful, it's not as pleasant. It'll go downhill until eventually, inexorably, it will turn into disgusting feelings. And you'll stop eating the cake because you'll vomit if you don't. It's the same with the object of a person. The Buddha's point is this: if the cake is the main cause of those pleasant feelings, hear this technically, if the cake is the main cause of those pleasant feelings, it is logical that the more cake you eat, the happier the feelings. So just extrapolate with the boyfriend. The more contact I have with the object of my attachment, the logic is, if Martin and his body and everything is the cause of my happiness, imagine having constant contact with that object, not going to sleep and getting hungry again the next day, but never stopping having contact with that object. You would vomit and die, and you'd have such disgust for Martin, you would never want to look at him again. This is not religion. This is scientific experience, but we don't analyze it like this. So of course it changes, because it's not possible, because the expectation of what Martin is and what Martin should do, the expectation of what the cake is and what it can do is not realistic. It's insane. It's like a fantasy. So we're bumping into unreality all the time, and that's why we suffer. Does that answer the question?
Yes.
So if there is love in that relationship, if there's a genuine empathy with him and a delight in his happiness, sure, there can be some pleasure as well from the sex, let's say, but if that's not the prevailing thing, if mainly empathy and love and kindness and forgiveness and generosity, then the relationship will last, as long as the karma is there. Then you'll just be content with each other, wrinkled and fat and old and crippled, and you'll still love each other. We know that. We can see relationships. But if it's only attachment, it's not possible for it to last. It's impossible for it to last. It is impossible for it to last, because it turns into aversion. The only place attachment can go is aversion. Aversion or indifference. There's no other option. Are we communicating, people?
Yes.
Okay, that's a very good point. What else about attachment and aversion and the emotions and the dealing? Well, then we'll go to Ingrid's point. Okay, I'll go to Ingrid's point. Okay, Ingrid. if we take the view that there are trillions and trillions and trillions of sentient beings, and let me use my abortion as the example. It's good to have a personal example. So when I was 23, living in London in 1968, I remember the National Health, had just approved abortions to be legal, right? So I felt like I'd won the lottery when I got pregnant at 23. I remember the moment, I was a hippie and I did what hippies did, I was a good hippie. So I had this boy, I remember this boy, and I remember I got pregnant. I knew straight away. I remember, this is an interesting point, by the way. Many women tell me this, and I had this experience. The moment I was, not trying to be too personal, but with this boy, and it was a vivid experience. At that moment with this boy, and I said to myself, oh no, I'm pregnant. I knew that because that's usually the moment, that's the moment for the Buddha at the time of conception, at the time when you're joined with the person, when the egg and the sperm. This is an interesting point now. Medically, I've heard that egg and sperm take a while to join. Does anybody know about this, by the way? Yeah. Does anybody know about eggs and sperms meeting in the fallopian tube? Kartik, you're a doctor, aren't you?
Yeah, yeah.
Kartik, do you know about this?
Yeah, I mean, the actual number of days, I'm not, I think it takes hours for the actual egg head to break into the sperm head to break into the egg and then get through.
Oh, hours, is it?
I'm not sure. I have to look it up and I have to quote. But it does take time. Yeah.
Well, this is an interesting point because the Buddha's view, and this is my experience, and many people the same have that experience at the time you're having that business with the partner. That second, I didn't know the words. I knew crystal clear. As I said the words, I'm pregnant. What I meant was a consciousness went into me. So that's this friend, another friend of mine, was her daughter and her husband were staying with her while they were building their house. And the daughter came down for breakfast one morning and said, oh, Mum, I'm pregnant. And the mother said, how did you know? When did you know? She said, 45 minutes ago. You understand? It's very common experience. So that's the Buddha's explanation. That's when the consciousness goes at that time. So that's interesting about the egg and the sperm, how it takes hours to meet. So I don't know how those two fit together. But in general, in my case, for example, so what's the scenario is this. There I was, the condition came together, me and a boy, me and the egg and the sperm, in other words, they met, right? Or eventually they meet. And then this is the condition that we see in our world for people to get a birth. So this consciousness from this person, there it was, that consciousness was in a previous body not more than a few weeks before that. And that person, when they died, that could have been an animal, could have been a human, doesn't who knows, but the particular karmic seed that from non-killing for that person was triggered at the time they stopped breathing, that programmed them then, a few weeks before that, to come to my fallopian tube. It's very personal. They had some strong karmic history with me. And obviously the boy, but me too. That's the point, because they came to my womb. That's really personal karma. Do you understand what I'm saying, first of all, Ingrid? That would have been the karma that was the main trigger at a few weeks before conception. The karmic seed that they had created of non-killing was triggered, that programmed that consciousness when it left the body eventually. And when I hopped into bed with that boy, that created the cause for that consciousness to come to my fallopian tube. There's a strong history between the two of us. You with me? Yeah. Then, this is the point though, you could argue the strength of the karma of that person to get killed from their own past killing. So the first karma was the type of rebirth they got. That's from non-killing. There's 4 tracks of karma, remember? The third track, which is called experiences similar to the cause. That was the one that the second they hit my fallopian tube, the thought arose in my mind, oh no, I'm pregnant. And I knew that second I did not want what would come out of the other end 9 months later. So I decided right then, almost at that second with that boy, to have an abortion. So that's the strength of the karma of that person from the third track of karma, from their past killing of me to get killed by me. That's how strong their karma was. And then all the conditions, you could argue this, the karma for them was so strong to be killed that there was nothing hindering it. The National Health had just approved free abortions. I went to the hospital, they agreed, and I went to the hospital at 12 weeks and I went and had an abortion. Everything was unhindered. It was so easy. So the karma for that person to be killed was so strong. Do you understand what I'm saying? And then I had the abortions. I did the killing. That's the first point to discuss. So you want to ask anything about that? That's clear so far?
Yeah, it's clear for me.
Okay, so far. Okay, good. So what interesting point here, I remember a friend of mine, somewhere I met a fellow, and he told me that it's only recently, he was like 45, he recently heard from his mother that she had decided when she got pregnant with him to have an abortion. She had it all organized. She was in the hospital. She was in her gown. She got off the bed. She had to walk from here to there. She put her hand on the doorknob and she changed her mind. He was so moved by this, he can't believe it. And that's the point of this is she had decided that she would kill. That's a tendency in her mind. But the karma of this boy in her womb was, even though she decided to have an abortion, you could argue he had such strong karma not to be killed that she changed her mind. He didn't have the karma to die. So there's always, it's a dynamic between the two, you know. So what is the karma of killing? Well, okay, let's analyze it as an action. Let's look at the conditions in place that determine what kind of action that is. So a complete action of killing, not killing, whatever you like, is got four main components. So let's analyze this particular action from my side. So first of all, very clear, there was the intent, there was the object there. It was a living being. It was a human being. And that's the point. It might not be a viable human being, which is how they talk in the West. It doesn't matter. It's still a consciousness there. By definition, it's a mind possessor. There's a consciousness, a person there from the past. The consciousness has come and joined that tiny egg and sperm. So what makes it a sentient being is very clear for the Buddhists, is there's a mind there. Do you see my point? It's a consciousness. Now, I know the Jews, I remember recently learning, the Jews say God doesn't put the soul there until several months later. So for Jews, you're not killing a human being if you have an abortion before a certain point. So obviously people have different viewpoints. But the Buddhist view is very clear that the consciousness, once the consciousness is there, that's a living being. It's clear. So first of all, there's a living being there, the first condition. Second, my mind involved in this action. And there's two parts. There's more to it than this, but this is simple. There's 2A, my intention. I knew I didn't have the thought, I will kill it, but I knew I'd have an abortion. So effectively, I'm saying, I will kill that baby. I don't want it. Do you understand? And the 2B is my motivation. This is really not complicated. We don't have to get guilty about this. It's normal. I mean, there's a million motivations. Many people can have different reasons for doing. But when it comes down to it, in mine, it was very clear. It was attachment. It wasn't anger. I didn't hate this baby. I just didn't. It was inarticulate. It was so clear. The karma was so strong. I remember I didn't think of it as a consciousness. I'd been a Catholic. I never didn't use the word soul. I wasn't a Buddhist at the time, so I didn't use the word mind. But I just know I didn't want this baby. So for me, the motivation was clearly attachment. It was very clear to not have this thing interfere with me. It was not. I didn't want it. So it was attachment. Very clear. Attachment, my motivation. 3, I did the action, but it's worse because I got the doctors to do it. Doctors and nurses had to do it for me. And then 4, the result, dead baby. Now, the point is with my particular action, it was extra heavy because they didn't pull out the fetus properly. They mangled it. And I had to go stay in the hospital, and they had to operate again and scrape it all out because the poor little fetus had been, not properly taken out. So that was extra heavy because the little creature must have suffered, So that's the analysis. Does that answer your question, Ingrid?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it did. Thank you very much.
So this is where, some of us have had abortions and maybe we haven't thought about it before, maybe we're shocked or whatever. This is always the point. It's like, then you think of what you decide, this is, now I'm using the Buddhist analysis for describing that event. So when I first heard about the karmic one, then of course, okay, I go, then I purify. Then I want to purify it. I want to clean it. I want to fix my karma up. And that's why we have to, the second, in terms of junior school practice, the first level of practice is you must stop harming sentient beings now. But the very next level of practice is we've got to purify the karmic seeds we have already planted and purify them before they ripen as further suffering. So at the end of the day, we'll go through this, at the end of the day, as Lama Zopa says, we are insane not to do the purification practice every day. Because, forget just one abortion. If we've got countless past lifetimes of karmic seeds and we're carrying them in our mind, they're all stored there, they don't go astray, billions of seeds from billions of actions. It's just, so naturally I want to do a bit of weeding, So at the end of every day, it's really marvelous to do the purification practice. And we'll discuss this before we finish today, how to clean up our act every day, Any other questions? We're going to have a break, I think, in a minute. Have a break, yeah. Any other questions? Honey is just another way of talking about the same things in a way. Karmic seeds is this literal term. Every time you do something, it leaves a seed. But sometimes they use the term there for seed or imprint. Imprint is a more, I think programming is good, but precisely a seed is a good analogy, or an imprint. But then one of the ways that seed will ripen is as a habit. Habit is one of the 4 ways that karma ripens. So the karmic of karma of killing, of non-killing will ripen, 1 as a rebirth, 2 as a habit, 3 as an experience, and 4 as the environmental. So habit is one way that a seed will ripen. Do you understand?
Yes. So for example, you said that like the 3-year-old playing the piano, so habits are ingrained. And
yes.
If you don't cultivate it, so if that 3-year-old is playing the piano, she's not from a musical household, so they don't cultivate that. Does that fade away and extinguish itself, or is it still there ingrained and might ripen in another lifetime?
Yeah, it stays there. It stays there, definitely. So if you've got the karma to kill, let's say, but you're born to a mummy who won't let you kill anything, then the karmic seeds are still there. But what's interesting is if you, and this is how we are if we're trying to be practitioners, we've all got karmic seeds to kill, but suddenly you become a Buddhist and you hear about not killing, and then you decide you will consciously take a vow not to kill, and you purify your habits, then you can pull them out before they ripen. That's the whole point. But if you don't have a conscious practice, they will just stay there. And they'll manage, and the conditions will ripen at some point. And if the karma is very strong, the conditions will ripen very quickly. And also, that's where you can have suffering. Let's say you've got a habit to steal, a strong habit, or kill, steal. Doesn't matter what it is, or play the piano for that matter. If the habit is really strong, but the conditions don't allow it to ripen, then that'll cause a lot of suffering. You know, the person who wants to steal all the time, but they've got nothing to steal, they'll always be distressed. That's where look at our mind. A person who's very strongly attached to sexual activity, for example. Do you understand? A very powerful habit of sexual activity, which is one of the deepest attachments we have. This is why they can't leave it out of their mind. A friend of mine on death row in Kentucky, my friend Mitch there, who's a Buddhist, he said, and I know this guy, he said, Robina, he thinks of torture all the time. So he can't torture anybody because his friends on death row won't allow him. So his mind, and look at our minds. This is the point, you know, Debbie, about habits. Our thoughts never stop. I mean, most of us sitting in these rooms together, we don't go around wanting to rape and kill and torture too many people, but we certainly think about food. Look at our habits, you know. I mean, if you have a habit to kill or steal, imagine if you're born with a tendency to want to jump on little girls all day. I mean, it will be torture if you can't, and it's torture if you can. So this is the tragedy of the karmic habits. These are the tendencies in our mind, Debbie. This is why we've got to start to at least control the body, and at least don't jump on the little girl, at least don't torture, then attempt to work on the mind. And that's what's hard. Because those habits are very strong. This poor guy on death row, I know him, he thinks of it all the time. He's not consciously doing it, but he can't stop the thoughts. That's the tragedy of the karmic imprints. And then if we understand our minds like this, we won't be so tortured. We won't be so angry with ourselves because we can't stop our thoughts. That's where we have to have the courage to recognize all the crazy thoughts and don't buy into them. Don't give them power. And that's why we think of meditation in such a wrong way. We know the pain of these thoughts is too much. We can't stand them and we feel guilty and neurotic. So we think, oh, good, I'll meditate. They'll all go away. This is nonsense. They won't. So that's why we've got to have the skill to be able to distinguish between the crazy thoughts and the valid thoughts and allow the crazy thoughts to be there, but not buy into them. Hear them like a bunch of crazy roommates all shouting next door. You can't stop them, but you at least don't follow them. You hear them, you know their old habits, but you learn to live with them, but you don't follow them. This is a major shift in practice when we can do that. But our trouble is because attachment is a junkie that only wants the nice things, and also our attachment only wants nice thoughts. That's why we go crazy and try to kill ourselves, because we can't bear the unhappy thoughts. But we've got to be brave. They're old habits. They're not going to go overnight. Do you understand, Debbie?
I do. Thank you.
Good, honey. Oh God, I mean, there's no question. I mean, when we see a simple old attachment to cake, it's like such a joke, you know. We can analyze the experience. You're sitting there feeling kind of, oh, what's missing? That's the feeling of dissatisfaction. There's this distress, you know, what's missing? Then you're desperate to find something, isn't it? Oh, good, then just the little thought of cake pops up and you get all excited. The mind starts getting all excited. This is attachment. Then you stand up and you go to the cake and you all the time, you won't forget. It's not as if you kind of go to the kitchen and you go, oh, what was I trying to get? You won't forget you're getting cake because attachment's very strong. It'll make you get it and you cut it and you put it on the plate and you all the time anticipating. And it's very inexorable. It's very hard to stop this process, isn't it? Think of the poor guy who tortures. You can't stop the thoughts. And it's just, even though part of you, let's say you've decided yesterday you'll eat less cake, one little part of your tiny little virtuous thought, very sneaky in the background, you can hardly even hear it, is saying, Kartik, you did say you wouldn't eat cake. And it's kind of attachment saying, shut up, you know. Attachment bullies in and takes over and goes. And even as you're eating the cake, little virtue saying, I don't want to eat more cake is very quiet, but it doesn't have much power. So that's how come the deluded thoughts. So it takes enormous courage just to go against that simple thought. That's just the thought of eating cake. That's courage. That's because, you know, when we see attachment, it's terrifying. This is why fear is the real basis. When you can't, even the attachment to the cake, it is terrifying to think of not getting it. I remember one time now it's typical, we all understand, I remember this from a relationship, being obsessed with a person. The horror of not seeing, of not getting the person, of not getting the object is absolutely terrifying. It's obvious it's fear. It's so clear it's fear. So the logic we have to use is, you've got to do lots of analysis and lots of logic. This is one approach of doing the conscious, logical analysis to argue with attachment's demented view that the object that attachment will get is not what you think you'll get. That's the thing, because it's a massive disconnect between reality. So it's the happiness, you will get a moment of pleasure when you eat that cake, but within 3 minutes of eating it, you're still dissatisfied and you've just got a fatter stomach. So we've got to do such analysis and such logic to argue with these thoughts before you even you can't make the thoughts go away, but at least not to follow the thoughts. That's how you learn to change. So of course it needs courage. And of course it's fear. Look at it, you know. Do you understand?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's very helpful.
Jessica, you were going to say something, were you, darling? No? All right. So why don't we have a quick break, folks? Be back in... It's 40, so back at 10 past. Yeah? I'll have some breakfast. Thank you, darlings.
Thank you, Venerable.
Bye.
Bye.